Welcome to the Last Drop Water Speaker Series. If you have an interest in water sustainability issues, the speaker series is for you. Today we're hosting a webinar on the topic of water and climate justice, advancing intersectional approaches. So the Last Drop is brought to you by the University of Manitoba's United Nations Academic Impact Hub for Sustainable Development Goal 6 Working Group. In 2018, the university was named the chair for this hub. And then in 2025, the successfully applied to renew our role. And we now have the honor of co-chairing with Shiv Nadar Institution of Eminence in India. So the SDG Working Group at brings together established and emerging leaders who have shared interest in freshwater sustainability and who work collaboratively with local, national, and global partners to address issues related to water. Members include researchers from across campus from multiple faculties, such as the Clayton H. Riddell Faculty of Earth, Environment, and Resources, Faculty of Agriculture and Food Sciences, Faculty of Architecture, Faculty of Arts, the Price Faculty of Engineering, the Faculty of Science, as well as collaborators from the Center for Human Rights Research, Center for Earth Observation Science, and the Office of Sustainability. So the SDG Group's expertise spans multiple disciplines, including leading researchers from the humanities, social sciences, and STEM fields. My name is Nicole Wilson, and I'm an assistant professor and Canada Research Chair in Arctic Environmental Change and Governance at the Center for Earth Observation and the Department of Environment and Geography in the CHR Faculty of Environment. So I co-chair the Working Group with Claire Herbert, also from CEOS, and I'm online today with Sarah Deckert from the Just Waters Project. So thank you very much to Sarah and to the Just Waters Project for co-organizing this event today. Sarah will add a couple of links to the chat related to the UNAI Hub and the Just Waters Project. In this virtual format, we are all coming from different locations. So I want to acknowledge that I am located in Winnipeg, Manitoba, within Treaty 1, and that the University of Manitoba campuses and research spaces are located on original lands of the Anishinaabe, Inanuak, Anishinabe, Dekoreyate, Dene, and Inuit, and on the national homeland of the Red River Métis. In the theme of today's panel, and the Last Drop generally, I want to acknowledge that my drinking water comes from Shoal Lake through the Winnipeg Aqueduct, which was constructed in 1919 at the expense of Shoal Lake 40 First Nations water security. As I mentioned, today's session focuses on water and climate justice. We held another version of this panel in May 2024 in person at the Canadian Human Rights Museum here in Winnipeg. Today's webinar brings the discussion to a broader audience through this virtual format. And so climate change refers to long-term shifts in temperature and weather patterns. Such shifts can be natural due to changes in the sun's activity or volcanic eruptions, but since the 1800s, human activity has been the main driver of climate change, primarily due to the generation of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane from burning fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas. Water and climate change are inextricably linked. Extreme weather events are making water more scarce, more unpredictable, more polluted. These impacts can be seen throughout the water cycle and are a threat to kind of human relationships with water. Climate change is driving the intensification of the global water system, but is not the only driver of water issues, but exacerbates other, related vulnerabilities caused by socioeconomic factors like intensive irrigation, settler colonialism, and other types of poor water governance. So changes in water and climate, as well as climate impacts, have diverse effects on human communities, and therefore water must be considered in all climate policy and action. The centrality of water to climate action is increasingly being acknowledged in global climate governance. Last year at COP29 resulted in the Baku Declaration on Water for Climate Action, and water is expected to play an important role at the COP30 in Belém, Brazil, which will run next week from the 10th to the 21st of November. So in today's event, we will engage the lens of water and climate justice to examine the differing, unequal, and disproportionate ways that water and climate change affect human communities. We're delighted to have 5 presenters who will engage with this topic, including Deborah McGregor, who is Anishinabe from White River First Nation and a professor at the University of Calgary. Linda Mendez-Barrientos is an assistant professor at the Joseph Corbell School of Global and Public Affairs at the University of Denver. Aimée Craft is an award-winning teacher and researcher recognized internationally as a leader in the area of Indigenous laws, treaties, and water. At the University of Ottawa, she holds a university chair in Nibe Minawa Aki Inakanagewin, Indigenous governance in relationship with water and land. Anaís Roque is an environmental social scientist and anthropologist who studies resource insecurity and health in the Anthropocene. She is an assistant professor at Duke University. And last but not least, Dr. Samir Shah is the John C. Garcia Professor and Assistant Professor of Climate Adaptation in the School of Environment and Forest Sciences at the University of Washington. The speakers' full bios are available on our website. So before we begin, I just wanted to mention a couple of quick logistics. We have enabled closed captioning, so please feel free to turn that on. We'll be recording this event and hope to post it to our Sustainability YouTube channel with the permission of our panelists. We will have a series of short talks from the presenters, followed by a panel discussion, and then there will be a Q&A at the end. So we ask the audience to hold their questions to the end or put them in the Q&A box where we'll address them. So now let's begin. We'll move to our flash talks with our first presenter, Deborah McGregor.
Ooh, so much pressure. Okay. I did have a couple of slides just to distract the audience so they're not staring at teeny little faces on their screens the whole time, because that's like so fun.
Here they come.
Yeah. So thank you, Nicole, for that introduction to the panelists. Looking forward to having a conversation with my panelists. So the way I wanted to talk about water and climate crisis or the justice was just referring to the fact that Indigenous peoples has sort of been, well, they have been, not sort of, been noticing that there's been a problem for some time. And then finally, global assessments come out, the global water reports come out, IPCC and climate assessments come out, IPCC come out, and basically we're in a very much dire situation, sometimes called Code Red, sometimes called, I just refer to them as the disaster reports because that's kind of the message we always get with them, which isn't terribly hopeful. Finally, acknowledgement that it's human induced because it wasn't always. But I think one of the things I wanted to say is in my work around climate change, which fortunately sort of originated more in an Indigenous context or a First Nation context. So I wasn't, I think sometimes I'm grateful that I wasn't so heavily influenced by the broader framework that the definitions that you see coming out of IPCC. Or other organizations. And I would say that those concepts of the scientific sort of explanation for what climate change is and what it's made up of is true. But the way I like to talk about it is it's not the only thing that's true. There's other things that are true about climate change in the way that Indigenous peoples also understand climate change and why that's happened. So in the work I've done with youth and elders around climate change, because they're not hung up on the literacy of it, what people call the literacy of it, which kind of irritates me actually, but you can stick climate in front of everything now and it's like climate whatever. And as they basically talk about it as human nature relationships. It isn't just about like the technical scientific definitions. It boils down to the nature of human relationships with the natural world. The climate is changing, but the reason why the climate is changing, the human-induced climatic changes, is because people have changed. People have changed the nature of their relationship to the natural world. So to move towards a path, a different path, in terms of the current trajectory that we're on, which is not a good one, people have to change. But I find in a lot of the solution space, it's very technically oriented. Even when people say innovation, basically they're referring to techno fixes. So I just wanted to say that that's sort of what I've been finding and noticing over time, being in this particular space where I go into the scientific, what I call the circles, and then I go to an Indigenous space and we talk about this very differently. So to me, a lot of it has to do with historical and ongoing relationship with the natural world, and colonialism has created all kinds of particular situations and challenges in relation to that, including our ability to be able to respond. Traditionally, my ancestors would have been able to meet their challenges based on their own terms. We were able to self-determine our own path forward and solutions. Now we're contending with all kinds of other factors as we try to do that. Here you just see exclusion of Indigenous peoples and their knowledges. That's sort of been like in the scientific realm until recently. That's been the case, and now there's an interest. What I'll say about that interest is there's an interest, but it doesn't necessarily mean that people know how to do it. How do you include Indigenous people meaningfully and knowledge in a lot of these spaces? So that's a lot to kind of throw at you in the first, probably hopefully that was only 2.5 minutes. So I kind of agree with Kyle White on this one in terms of what's the real issue that we're talking about. He describes it as a relationship crisis. It's actually a crisis of these relationships between people and the natural world, between dominant society and Indigenous peoples and other vulnerable and marginalized people. So it boils down to the kind of relationships that we have. Colonial practices, again, complicate that. We have damaged relationships, so we have to move away from harmful, damaging relationships to one of healing, depending on your point of view, reconciliation, or moving towards a different kind of relationships, which relates to justice. Again, I talked about the techno fix. Oh my goodness, it is so dominant. It is so hard to like crack the code and talk about other things other than techno fixes. And also kinship, like our kinship with the natural world. So I think there's so much focus on humans and human settlements, which is valid. Again, that's true. And I would never say that's not important, but it's also our kin. It's also the natural world that's also important in Indigenous conceptions of climate justice. And I'm probably up to my 5 minutes, so I will stop there and thank you. Hopefully that kind of made sense. That's a lot to jam in there in 5 minutes. So appreciate the opportunity.
That was great, Deb. Thank you very much. And we'll have Linda next. I think Linda had some slides.
Yeah, I also have slides very briefly, so if Sarah can help put them on. But while that's happening, thank you so much for the invitation to join you. Yeah, so I'm an environmental governance scholar at the Cornell School of Global and Public Affairs. And so I'm looking at this from a governance perspective. And so let's see if we can put these slides on. There we go. Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, if you can go to the next slide. I don't know if I have control. Yeah, I wanted to start. The first question that Nicole asked us to think about was, how does our work address the intersection of water and climate justice? And so I wanted to start with this, with this graph, because it shows basically that you can see in the graph above a growth, right? There's like a growth of people that are, over time, instead of reducing the amount of people that live under water scarcity, we have increased that over time to the point that today we have over 2 billion people, or more than a quarter of the world's population, living under water scarcity. And this is happening despite global efforts, including by the United Nations, to address this issue of water insecurity. And we're doing this through global water reforms. So if Sarah can go to the second slide, my focus has been that we have water insecurity despite this landmark, very ambitious governance reforms, environmental reforms. And if you can see in the slide, we have two very famous examples of ambitious environmental natural resources governance reforms, such as the South African Land and Water Reform, signed the Constitution when Nelson Mandela became president, and California's groundwater reform to deal with the overdraft crisis that engulfed California in the latest drought. And so, importantly, if you go to the next slide, governance reforms, are seldom socially and ecologically transformative. So we're doing all these investments, billions of dollars, and trying to solve this issue, but we are not really seeing the outcomes and our goals being achieved. And so my work deals with this question. I'm trying to understand, why is this the case? Why is it so prevalent? And what are the implications of failing institutional arrangement efforts worldwide for climate and water justice? And within this, I focus on power, meaning the power asymmetries among different groups of people and policy actors, and how these asymmetries are shaping the processes, the governance process, the public policy implementation processes, and of course, the outcomes that result from these processes. And so this is my approach on how to address water and climate justice, really looking forward to the governance processes and the solutions that are being proposed, who is included and what perspectives are included and how, or excluded, and how that eventually shapes what we're seeing on the ground in terms of outcomes and outputs that are, that we're starting to see as a result of these efforts to, solve different issues around the globe. So if you go to the last slide, that's a little bit about me. These are my 2 websites that you can check, and I'm happy to talk more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda. So next we'll move to Aimée Craft.
Thanks, Nicole, and thank you to Deb and Linda for setting that stage. I think we all come to this same question or the same topic with different lenses, and mine is through the lens of law, and particularly thinking about conflicts of laws between settler state colonial law and Indigenous legal orders. And I've worked a lot in the context of revitalization of Indigenous laws and legal orders in relation to water through different Indigenous legal mechanisms. But I think on this topic, and kind of where I'm starting to shift some of my research, is into thinking about environmental decision-making as a whole, and how there are huge gaps, for example, in just thinking about water or even climate, in the idea of siloing out certain aspects of environmental decision making. So siloing out, for example, the system by which, or the values by which we make decisions, the types of structures around decision making, the principles that are involved, and the process. So some examples would be, siloed approaches, valued ecological components that are considered in environmental assessment. That looks at kind of like single species or single resource parts of the environment, but kind of disaggregated from one another. And they're not integrated in thinking, and they kind of balance off each other. And so the other silo I think that I want to point to is how we employ tests that continue to separate those out and kind of look at the potential to mitigate impacts in all of these different siloed areas to culminate into a whole that becomes acceptable, but doesn't actually understand the relationships that exist between all of those siloed out components, and what a collective picture or an aggregated picture might tell us that is different than the results that we get by siloing out. So hopefully that's making sense for others. That's kind of where I'm looking at. And some challenges are in how regulatory systems and environmental assessment are really focused on even separating out systems of values like biophysical versus economic versus social. Like there's kind of a push to integrate all of those different factors, but they remain kind of separate from one another in some magical equation, which I still haven't figured out, of trying to arrive at decisions based on some kind of environmental standard that I think is still very obscure. So in all of that, there's usually a singular legal framework, like I said, that is obscure, that is underlying it. And I think the shift towards pluralism is where I'm thinking we might be able to achieve a little bit more water and climate justice. And I think of this particularly for myself in terms of hydroelectric development. I've written on this and co-edited a couple of volumes. And kind of the trend now to moving towards thinking on the scale of cumulative effects over time and cumulative effects in scope, the possibilities of regional assessment, so looking at things within regions rather than projects, and then thinking about integrated evaluation, Indigenous-led assessment, shared decision making, all of these as different opportunities for actually engaging water and climate justice. So hopefully that, we're seeing points of connection, but mine is really from that legal and regulatory approach and a critique of the silos that are artificially imposed and kind of challenge what Deb was talking about, which, the human relationships with the natural world, it fragments them. And that's so contrary to how most Indigenous people view the world, but how Indigenous laws actually are approaching those six systems of governance amongst different living beings. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aimée. So we'll move to our next speaker now, Anaís Roque.
Thanks, Nicole, and thanks to everybody that's spoken so far. I think it's gonna go very aligned. I'm coming from this work and these questions that Nicole posed to us from anthropology and just thinking broadly from bottom-up initiatives. And so if we can go to the next slide, please. So I'm a disaster anthropologist and environmental social scientist, and so sometimes people don't really make the connections, but because of anthropogenic climate change and poor state preparedness, or just where we see reduction of state involvement or investments in topic of social welfare, we'll see that disasters will become like a core of the challenges that people will face to address water security. This image here just shows that, for example, a lot of my key work is in Puerto Rico, it's in the Caribbean, and Latin America and the Caribbean are the second largest, most disaster-prone region in the world, behind Asia. And we see also thinking from a climate justice lens that the region only contributes between 6 to 8% of the global green gas, right? So where we're thinking they experience a majority of the disasters, yet contribute very little into these. And so in my research, when I think about this question about how my work addresses that intersection of climate and water justice, it's not only thinking about the distribution of benefits and burdens, but really thinking about what are households and communities doing to address these in the context of disasters where they already have experience and are bringing other social and economic vulnerabilities to their lives. Next slide, please. And so this image, I like to show it in presentations because Puerto Rico is also part of the United States, right? Even though it sits in the Caribbean. And so this image is about the 2024 billion in weather and climate disasters. And it just shows us that disasters will continue to happen, and they are a big economic threat to economies. Yet we see in our current policies that both data has been removed from federal level management, and also a big disinvestment of federal government. And so that means that states and communities will have to bear, again, more of the responsibility for events that they are not necessarily the ones that created in the first place. Last slide. I have two more, yeah. So this one is just to show you a bit of the context. So Puerto Rico, if you're not familiar with it, it's located in the Caribbean. It has an explicit colonial relationship with the United States, primarily as scholars have seen it through our inability to make decisions around our sovereignty. So for example, we have US citizenship, but we can't vote for the United States president. We're at more than 1,000 miles away from United States continental, and policies challenge us in having international engagement. And so in our water systems, particularly in my research looking both at how households respond to water insecurities in disasters and also how communities that are organized in their centralized water systems, what we continue to see in the profile of the people that are engaging in these processes is that these become like short-term band-aids to larger structural issues. And so we see, we have a 14-year economic recession, we have onward migration, changed demographic patterns. A lot of the 28% of the population is 65 years and older, right? So you have all these compounding relationships that shape how people enact the right of the human need for water. And then the last slide, which is to the last question that Nicole asked us to reflect on, which is, what do water and climate justice mean to you? And I think from a research perspective, really interested in this idea again of like how households and communities are responding to their need for water in the wake of these emerging crises and explicit like disasters, but also these debates around self-management and how, to what extent the state needs to be involved more in providing water systems, proper water systems and access to water versus communities having to engage. And so the autogestión or self-management literature has been helping me to think through these things. And there's two key debates on that, in which one is more of like around self-organizing, in which the production and the actions are done by those that are directly impacted by the phenomena at hand without involving the state. And that will mean that there's going to be like a political transformation. This a neoliberal reaction approach, which is more this idea that as households and communities seek their own justice and seek their own self-organizing, but do not engage with the state then uses their opportunities to then support markets and other, assistance is moved elsewhere, right? So there is these tensions to what extent households and communities should be bearing the responsibilities around securing their water versus what role does the government play in this, right? And so that's where I come into this conversation. So I would like to find more pathways to move some of this theoretical thinking and empirical work more into like actual applications with more explicit political participation or engagement in decision-making spaces. And I'll stop it at that. Thank you so much, Nicole.
Thank you very much, Anaís. And now we'll move to Samir Shah.
Great. Thank you, Nicole, and thank you, everyone. Great to be with you this morning. So I'm an environmental social scientist, and I have an interest in social vulnerability and climate solutions termed broadly, including mitigation, climate adaptation, as well as how we prepare for disasters and respond to disasters. And, in reflecting kind of over the last decade or so, I started my journey into this field being very interested in issues around water access and global development. I didn't really see myself as someone that was entering the climate space, but soon became aware a lot of the key case studies and context around issues like water security were happening in very volatile climate change and variability contexts, from El Nino Southern Oscillation events in the Philippines to drought in Western India, and really impacting people on the front lines very differently, right? So a lot of the work that we do at the University of Washington in our lab group kind of is separated into three different buckets. The first one is, climate impacts, right? How do we understand this idea of a climate impact? Why do differential risks and vulnerabilities exist when it comes to studying climate water issues, such as droughts or hurricanes or flooding events? And I think here we're really interested in deconstructing this idea of what a climate impact means, not as a biophysical event alone, and not even as a longer term statistical change in how our atmosphere is being modified, but how people come to understand and experience that change locally. And if we take that perspective, climate change can mean many different things, including how the lived environment has changed within a generation or within people's own lifetime. And it also means that we bring forward this idea of what we call co-production, how the social, economic, and political systems around us co-produce the biophysical changes that we often relegate as somehow separate or independent from those systems. So that's one issue that we're really interested in looking at and keep looking at. The other one is really around climate adaptation policies and kind of more broadly what climate adaptation actually means. And like Deb mentioned, climate adaptation is often seen as a very technocratic, infrastructural kind of solution. Um, so our research is quite interested in broadening that, challenging those ideas. Why do climate adaptations look the way they do? What kinds of effects do they have when they're implemented? And more recently, how can they actually go wrong? And we call this idea climate maladaptation, when the risk reduction initiatives that are designed to support communities or intended to support communities have the inverse effect of actually heightening vulnerability for those that are most in need and most at risk from these kinds of events. So how do those things actually manifest, and what do we do about it is something that we're doing at the University of Washington. And the last is thinking about long-term social vulnerability reduction and disaster risk management, including extreme events like hurricanes and flooding. And some of this work has occurred in collaboration with the panelists, including Professor Roque and work in Puerto Rico. So that's broadly what kind of our group does. Nicole asks us to reflect on, what does this issue of climate and water justice mean to you? I think, we all come at it very differently from our own contexts. And the way I'm entering this conversation today is to kind of think about it more from an adaptation and risk management side. And the first thing that comes to my mind when we ask what does this actually mean to you is the need to kind of redefine the climate problem and the climate crisis. And the first step in doing that is to really foreground and center human dignity, human well-being, humanity, human capabilities. And I think even that idea is very important because when we think about climate and water issues, sometimes we foreground those and separate them from the actual people and places that are affected. And when we frame problems more from this human-centered or this lived experience approach, it opens up a lot of different pathways to think about the climate problem and importantly, the climate solutions very, very differently. So that's one aspect is that redefining the climate problem from one of, purely environmental change to one that is much more human-centered, human-grounded, opens us up to a lot of different types of solutions that we might otherwise discount and not even think about as connected to being a climate issue or a climate fix. Um, and then kind of related to that last point, as I think I'm getting to my 5 minutes, is that we need to be very attentive to this idea of the politics of knowing and the politics of solutions creation. And very rarely are climate solutions disconnected from other interests, maybe economic interests or political interests, market or business interests that may not have relevance to people's lives that are experiencing these really severe impacts. So that's kind of what I want to get at when I think about the politics of knowing who is creating these and what are the broader interests at play that shape the solution space and the solutions that ultimately surface. So I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to the discussion with you all.
Thanks so much, Samir, and thanks to all of you for sharing some really distinct perspectives on a similar question from across your context. And I'm really excited to engage with you all here in a panel discussion. So just a reminder, if you have questions, rather than raising your hand, please put them in the Q&A and we'll address them at the end in the last 15 minutes or so. So we'll just start with a couple of guiding questions that we had put together and see how things develop amongst the panelists. I think I'll pose a couple of questions and you can just choose what order to answer in. So feel free to volunteer. So combined water and climate crises kind of present urgent challenges for the human and natural world. There are many proposed solutions being implemented to address these challenges. How can a justice lens help us think critically about these solutions and the potential new problems they might introduce? Anyone want to? We could just go in order also. Yeah. All right.
Okay. It's a good question and builds on the other panelists and some of their comments. If justice is not a lens in coming up with solutions or pathways to, and it's actually really hard to get that lens into climate solutions, actually, like it's there and kind of recognized as being moving towards climate justice. But I find it's actually really hard to account for it if you're wanting to engage. So, for example, people with disabilities or youth, like when people are trying to figure out what the solutions are, usually people with money, um, either universities or ENGOs or governments or whomever, they're not great at that kind of engagement. They're not great at, even though they, I guess the context is in the IPCC space as we're grappling a lot with this in terms of our writing and how you assess, and you're working with the existing body of knowledge, which is generally published. You're missing a lot of really important knowledge in there when you're trying to come up with solutions or pathways to get out of the great big huge mess of the climate crisis. And there isn't, in my view, a lot of meaningful engagement with the people who are most impacted, like where the justice becomes an issue, whoever they might be, informal settlements or indigenous peoples or others. So that's a big problem, is you don't even have the voice of the people who are most impacted. And if you do, how seriously is that considered in a lot of these spaces? Do people know what to do about what they're saying? And a lot of the times it's going to challenge a lot of the status quo that produces the problem in the first place. So those are some of the challenges. Because I think about this from an Indigenous lens, so I'm reluctant to talk about it the way some of the other panelists have. So a couple, like I started to think about this recently I'm taking way too long, but I just thought they're really good examples of that drove me crazy. I think it was the COP that was, maybe it's the one in Scotland. And there was, so at this time, CBC is trying to cover these stories. It'll probably happen again when the next COP is happening in the next couple of weeks. Like, where are we at with climate change? What are our solutions? What are we defining as being the problem? And it was a story. At first, I kind of thought it was a joke, because one of them was, and this is out of a person out of Cambridge, these scientists out of Cambridge who are trying to make whale poo. And the reason they're trying to make whale poo, there's probably a scientific word to describe whale poo, is because it's a carbon sink in the ocean. So they think this is like a climate solution, like like literally humans think they can make whale poo, and they think they can make whale poo better than whales can. And so there was just so many problems with that, because I think natural whale poo probably works in a certain way in the ocean ecosystem, in a way that probably, and literally, because it was old white man from Cambridge, literally man-made whale poo. It's not women-made whale poo. Anyway, so there's a big gender kind of privilege component to this. And so that was one story that I found completely and utterly appalling. And so I said, wow, like maybe we should just work with the whales and figure this out rather than try to replicate with the whales. Probably do much better than people. The other one was coming out of, I believe, Australia, and it was, which was strange to me, an ice making machine. In my brain, I'm thinking like time machine or something, like something really weird. And they want to make ice in the Arctic, more as to get into the carbon market. So it's still motivated by capitalism, I think, in many ways. And in my brain, as I'm listening to these stories, these solutions, and I'm thinking, did you actually talk to Inuit about this? Like there was no engagement with it. Do they want this? Like there's so many things wrong with these kind of solutions that clearly are being funded somewhere to come up with these. I don't know what the status of them are. Like, for all I know, there's a bunch of little white-coated scientists running around trying to figure this all out. And underlying, I think what came to me as I was thinking more about this again in these spaces that I find myself in is I started to realize what it was human arrogance to think they have all the answers, that they just have all the answers and science and technology are going to solve it. I think science and technology can be a tool to help us do that, but it's not the solution itself. People get the two of them mixed up. So there's just so much arrogance in terms of what's going to be the climate, what's going to be the climate solution. Sometimes it's actually motivated, maybe not necessarily trying to solve it, but by being in the capitalist kind of market. So those are things that kind of come to mind, is just a lack of engagement by the people who are the most affected. And even if there's engagement, how does that voice have an impact in the work that's being done? And the other part of it is humans thinking somehow they can do better what nature does, as opposed to working with nature. And not like nature-based solutions in the way that people generally think about it, but that can be another conversation. Yeah, so I just thought I'd start off by saying that, because those are a couple of things that have been really bugging me, and I was trying to think about what elders have said about people need to change and what are our values and ethics around this. And there's just like arrogance oozing out of people's pores thinking of this stuff. And I'm like, wow, like it's, anyway, I do not see those as being appropriate solutions to actually addressing, the challenge that all life is actually facing. So I don't know, hopefully that stimulates some thinking by others.
Does anyone else want to jump in there? Aimée?
Sure. Well, how can a justice lens help us understand? I think a justice lens can help us understand, but with some limitations. So I think about justice as still very human-centric from most governance and legal paradigms. And I think that's illustrated in kind of the human rights equality to equality transformation. We still have everything centered around the rights of humans or the justice of humans. There's kind of an innate recognition of justice as human justice rather than justice more broadly and relating to relations. So I think that's kind of the limitation and challenge of thinking about thinking through justice, a justice lens. And I think it also engages what kind of this critique of what is acceptable risk, what is acceptable harm, and what is acceptable cost. Like it becomes, and I think in climate generally, there's this idea of trade-offs. I think if we're thinking about justice, we come into sets of values about trade-offs and values of certain things versus others. And so it becomes mathematical and based on sets of values, and then dominant values kind of outweigh, what is minority value. And so, yeah, I think about that as a limitation, and also kind of the trajectory, like the train that has left the station. If we think about, where our biggest climate impacts are, they're usually in mega industry, natural resource extraction projects. And I mean that, not usually and exclusively, but in part, and the questions of like dissociation. So we have like the things that are related to climate crisis in urban centers, but industrialization in kind of the non-evident spaces. I guess in a way, what I'm trying to say is that there are considerations that go beyond the human, when we think of climate justice in terms of where we find acceptable cost. I think that was really inarticulate, but things that are on the backs of, and some of the speakers have already referenced this, what is acceptable on the back of certain people when it's removed from majority or associated with certain sets of values. Hopefully there's something to glean from that, and maybe others can pick up on it as well.
Certainly. Did anyone have a response to anything that's been said so far, or just an answer to the question generally.
Maybe I'll jump in.
Sure.
I really appreciated both Deborah and Aimée's comments, because I feel like the hill is so high to even get justice acknowledged and integrated in policy process design and implementation. And it may just made me realize, because in my day-to-day, right, like I'm so focused on how can we integrate a justice lens on policy processes, right? That's what I breathe every day. And you know, it may just challenge me right now to think beyond that frame, you know, to integrate non-human elements that I personally don't think about every day. But I think I think that if, you know, we have not been even successful to get just consideration for other people's in governance processes. If we cannot even do that, it's hard for me to then think about how can we even then think about non-human elements in policy processes, right? And so the hill, that's why I started, like the hill is so high, right? And every time we get some recognition of the issues of what we're talking about, then we have this backlash politically that is trying to erase all of the learning and acknowledgement that we may have had, right? So there's this, on one side, we have, you know, maybe some progress. There's some people that are on board, that are fighting, that are trying to really affect change in local politics, to think about inequality and social ecological conditions that are already there, that shape who gets affected and who gets hit by climate events and who does not. So even though we may have some scientists, some policymakers on board on one side, every time we make some strides, I feel there is other forces at play and private interests at play and people who have a lot of power that do not want the status quo to change because they benefit from it. And that, so the hill is it's so high, right? The mountain is so high that I feel that even though I acknowledge what MS says, and I think that's important, I think there has to be some, you know, we have to propose new frameworks. Perhaps justice is not what it really encompasses everyone in the panel, but we really need to be united and pragmatic and maybe if it's not justice, I want to know what will be better so that we can gather behind that and really, you know, advance our scholarship, our teaching with the students on something that it's more equitable, more encompassing, so that we can really, you know, gather momentum and movement building to keep on this road where we already are, right? Climbing that hill, trying to integrate, from my perspective, right? Like what I've been trying to do is trying to, you know, have other scientists, other colleagues, and other policymakers think about, you know, how can we integrate justice? How can we think about power asymmetries in these policy processes and think about how those prior conditions, the social context, the social inequality, which is really the fuel for climate change, right? Like climate change is just a spark, but the fuel to what we're seeing, it's really social inequality, right? And so that's my job. I feel like I, as a teacher, as an educator, I'm trying to really demystify this idea that climate change is before and after what explains our world. And if we all agree that it's actually the social ecological conditions at place and social inequality what really creates these differentiated experiences of climate change, if we can agree on that and then think about actively when policymakers are designing those solutions, right? If they were thinking about who gets affected and why some people get affected more than others and others are, fine no matter what happens, then we can actually, if we, create more tangible, applicable solutions that are actually going to address the issues instead of like, thinking about poo, well poo, or, whatever techno fix that may actually not really, it's like a distraction, really. It's not really hitting the root of the cause of the issue. Anyway, I'm sorry, I was just reacting. Maybe I didn't answer the questions, but Deborah and Aimée really made me think about in expanding my frameworks to really address this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Anybody else want to respond?
I'll pitch in. I think this has been very also, I've been taking notes because it's been also very exciting in my brain, even though it's such a critical issue. When I hear this question, the first thing that kept coming back to my head were maps. And it's because this idea of like, the general basis of like who bears the benefits and burdens on a particular issue, right? In particular environmental issue, water specifically. And I think also about scale. I work predominantly with community leaders, nonprofit organizations, grassroots organizations in Puerto Rico, and I find that many times they do have the solutions at hand. Some of them are very socially driven solutions, right? Like household water exchanges, looking for, taking water from places, move, right? Like, so there are some solutions. Then there's these more technical fix technical solutions, but I think there is a need for like a bridge, right? And I think that when you are able to map also who are the actors that are like the formal and the informal actors that shape these decisions around how water is managed, how water is viewed, what values are accepted or not across society, that's where I think justice, the ideas of justice and these broader concepts of justice come and are very helpful. I think at a neighborhood scale, and at a municipality scale, I've seen some good like examples of how things can change. But then when you add that climate justice lens, which in my head and my understanding of the literature is so much more about, the world and green gas emissions, et cetera, it's like that's where things for me start getting a little bit more fussy. I think if we invest more in local and bridge that into more meso and engage at that state level, we would be able to move those ideas a bit more strongly. And sometimes the climate change umbrella, the climate justice concept for me feels too big. Like it's hard for me to really engage it. Even as I was preparing my remarks for this presentation, it was, well, green gas emissions, yes, but then there's these other elements and these solutions and the scales of these solutions. Like how can, for example, people in Puerto Rico, again, because of our relation with the United States, like we really can't engage with like the UN or these other international actors in the ways that maybe others can, right, that work in other contexts. So we're also constrained by those really legal frameworks, right, and policies that don't allow us. So I try to think about it more inwards, more at the neighborhood, at the municipality scale, and use that as a bridge. But I also, last thing I'll say real quick is that I do think that justice without explicit or more work around like Linda's work, like on power and just like political engagement more broadly, we're losing like a big opportunity there. Because we are seeing a rise of values and ideas around the world that are very explicitly against what we're all discussing here. And if we don't put ourselves in the table, either that be through organizing, that be through voting, that be through, supporting leadership that is moving some of these environmental and water justice ideals, like it's gonna be very hard to reach to broader audiences. And I do find that a lot of us tend to scare ourselves or myself from those conversations, but we are at a time in which science and thinking about like justice as a diagnosis framework, for example, like we need to be more active in our engagement in that way. And that's a very personal decision. That's, we all work in universities. They're also like part of broader our businesses and institutions, right? We do all have bosses and limitations in our work. But I do think that there is something there to say about that the action component of what justice means and how we operationalize that. So I'll shut up for my rant. Sorry.
Thank you so much.
Few comments. I think when I think about your question, Nicole, how can a justice lens help us think about solutions more critically and the problems that they might have? The way I've come to think about justice more broadly as a relational concept. It's very difficult for us to know what justice is, independent of listening or hearing or working with people that have been directly affected. And I think that's something that can't be lost. It's a really important way of thinking about environmental and social issues together, because it draws focus to the relationships between people and places and climate and water in ways that, even perhaps through our own education in universities, we've been taught to think of as separate things and separate things that are independent in some way. And I think, when we think about justice as a relational concept and really think about relationships, whether we know it or not, we're kind of taking one step out of this climate box. And what I mean by like the climate box is that, I can't remember who mentioned it. It might have been Deb, but, thinking about like climate change, determines everything, right? It's often seen as the single variable that shapes people's lives, and we see it in many different contexts, even though other processes and relationships are very important in terms of shaping how people experience those kinds of impacts. So I think it also is, a way of pushing back a little bit on just some of the ways in which the kind of scientific process has its impacts. And this isn't to say that science is unimportant or that climate change isn't happening. It's to say that, the way in which we create knowledge has sometimes very implicit and very strong effects in terms of how we represent the world. And I think in the case of maybe the Western quote unquote scientific approach to this, it's usually been about trying to deconstruct the world, isolating it in terms of its components, and then trying to build it back and represent it through models and our own assumptions over what we think are important in how we represent people's communities and places. And I think through that process, we've seen climate become very elevated, and numerous scholars have kind of talked about this in their own ideas and work. But I think, the relationality bit helps us to kind of counter that idea in some way, right? And I think, Anaís mentioned around mapping and knowledge production. So I think a lot of these ideas are connected, but the way I'm thinking about this is not just in terms of understanding, the impacts that people face, but how justice and just thinking about relationships between people, place, climate, and water, and if we really take that seriously, can be an important vehicle for really representing the world in a different way than the traditional scientific model has done in the past. I think when we do that, we are taking one step towards building more inclusivity into what it means to think about climate solutions. So I think, and when I say inclusivity, I kind of mean broadening the tent approach a little bit more and thinking about climate issues as many other types of issues, from housing to food to water costs and so forth. But I also think in relation to that, we need to be attentive to how people themselves talk about climate change, right? And I think the way that, academics and scientists might think about it in the United States or Canada or Australia or wherever it is really, really different than how people that are experiencing these impacts talk about it. So I think we have a lot to learn in terms of just representing what it means to talk about climate change as a phenomenon and as an impact. And I think learning from other people, hearing what other people have to say in terms of how they experience those kinds of stressors, can also get us to a place where we're thinking relationally about how a lot of different things affect people's lives. And we might not know that we're doing it, but we are, I think, when we take that step forward.
Thank you very much. So we've got about 12 minutes left of this discussion. So I'm just going to ask one more question, and we'll maybe see who would like to answer it. Yeah, some great discussion has been had so far. So thinking about how often this kind of approach to thinking about climate change, often when we're thinking about justice and things like that, is focused on kind of a cataloging of vulnerabilities and harms as well. And kind of often there are blinders on kind of the larger context of what the root causes of some of these harms are, and how any kind of proposed climate solution might interact with those. I think there's, a lot of transformative potential that has been mentioned in terms of the initiatives at the local scale or other scales, and in seeing how people themselves understand climate and understand not just climate change, but also their goals for their own lives. So thinking a bit about how we move beyond kind of this framing of impacts and damages towards more transformative solutions. So how can water and climate justice advance, or other frameworks that we've been discussing, advance transformative solutions or approaches that are towards more just and desirable futures, whether it be for Indigenous peoples, racialized people, or other groups that are disproportionately disadvantaged by climate change and other environmental changes. So I guess I'm placing the emphasis on, transformative solutions, but according to the kind of desires of those communities. So if you have any, examples you want to mention or anything like that, hopefully that question was clear. But yeah, any last minute comments about, how can we engage a justice framework or some of these other frameworks to think about desire-based change?
I guess I can start. So well, I'll just kind of make comments about that because I'm not convinced that, I mean, there are transformation, I guess, processes out there. I think IPBES recently came out with a transformation framework because all of these disaster reports say we need to transform. And it's like, okay. But then what's being proposed just kind of looks like a tweaking of the status quo or tweaking of the business as usual. And there's a number of ways that I think about it when I'm asked this question. I don't think there's going to be a checklist for it. And I think people want, if we do this and we do this and we do this, this is going to be the outcome. But even from this panel, it's very diverse in terms of people's experiences, the maps that people talked about, how policy can incorporate justice into it and how that can be undone so quickly. Undone very quickly in a very short period of time, depending on who's in charge and who's in power. So I think the way I think about it from an Indigenous perspective is, more specifically Anishinaabe perspective is, we have had to transform because we've faced our annihilation and genocide before. And so for us, it's and other people's solutions don't work out that well for us. That's kind of what we've found over time. That was one of the main findings of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People. So I don't necessarily have a lot of confidence that people are going to have the solution for, or what transformation should look like for Indigenous people. That would be something they would determine themselves. But it was always our own traditions and knowledge and language that helped us. So I could be here and say, I'm part of the Anishinaabe Nation. But those are under threat at the moment. So part of a transformation to climate justice for us is supporting Indigenous peoples to be able to enable those kind of, I'll just say, factors or way of life that enable us to be able to survive, that'll continue to do that for us. That's kind of what our stories and our own climate knowledge kind of tells us. That it doesn't mean going back to the past, like that's sort of a misconception that people have about that, but it means that those are the things that enable resilience into the future for us. When I think about the data, and there's other people have done empirical research to support it, but this is sort of the one that the United Nations kind of puts out there is Indigenous peoples, I say caretake or steward 20% of the world's terrestrial resources, but that's where 80% of the biodiversity is. And that's also where Indigenous languages are spoken. So what about that? So I think there's probably something to learn from people who figured that out. Like, and it's not even recent in response to the climate change, it's always kind of been there. So my view, just building upon what others have said, marginalized, Indigenous, vulnerable peoples have climate knowledge. It's just how do you then mobilize it to actually influence these broader spaces. So yeah, so I do think about transformation a lot. And when I do talk about it, people want the checklist, sort of like duty to consult. What's the checklist? What do I need to do? What's my checklist? Do I go outside and, I don't know, feed a raccoon or something? Whatever it is, they want some kind of easy answer, but there isn't an easy answer to any of this other than, I guess the other thing that I say, sorry, I'm kind of rambling a bit because I do think about this quite a bit, but I really should probably write something so my thoughts are more coherent, is I think transformation should result in, like, ideally a different trajectory, like something else than what it is right now. All the kind of issues and challenges that people have talked about on this panel. And I find a lot of the times what's lacking is just generally a lack of imagination. What does it look like if it's not this? What does it look like? And that's where I think involving people who are not in the box, right? Youth or elders or artists and others need to be a bigger part of these conversations because it is so dominated by science. That's kind of what's been funded. A lot of the times people did analysis of this and not so much the humanities, maybe more so the social sciences these days. So sometimes I think it's just kind of scares people because they just don't have the imagination. What does it look like if this isn't what our life is? Do I still get my Starbucks? Like, people get really panicky about these kind of things. So yeah, that's my kind of my rant on that. I do think about it quite a bit and would like to hear from others, but I don't have the answer. I say as a researcher, we just try to figure out what the answers might be. I don't have them. Hopefully that was at least food for thought.
Yeah, that's a good critique of the term transformation. It is ubiquitous right now and often used in ways that do not actually seem transformative at all. Is there anyone else that wants to add anything there? We've got about 4 minutes left, and if people don't want to add anything, we've got 4 or 5 questions in the chat that we could move to. So unless there's any final comments. Okay. Oh, Linda.
Yeah, I just want to say, I agree with everything that they've said, but I think it's more than just imagination, right? Personally, I study policy processes that are meant to be transformative. The whole idea of this acts and new bills and new processes that I'm studying is to reorganize governance. And so they start with this idea that we're going to include all these people, we're going to think about this differently. So, but we still find that even in processes that are meant to be, that are willing and want to supposedly reorganize how we do things, how we think about the issues, and what types of solutions, the sky's the limit. Let's think about what solutions we are going to come up with, even when we have maybe perhaps not a lack of imagination, and we have people on the table that are coming from different perspectives. We have Indigenous tribe representatives, we have disadvantaged communities and people who do not have water at the table talking and being part of those deliberations. Even when we have that, and for policymakers, that Deborah mentioned the checklist, right? For policymakers, when they see we have this diverse representation of people, and it's like, check, I did my engagement, right? Like, I have a diverse set of people here who are different ideas, and they're all deliberating, trying to think about, how can we develop collaborative institutions or collaborative forms of governance so that we can solve these issues. Even when we have supposedly all the elements that we will want to, push forward in, to create these transformative solutions, we still see, right, that they fall short, that we have some gains, but then we have some losses. And so I would argue that beyond the lack of imagination, what's happening is that there are a couple things, right? Like, there's extreme asymmetries in the actors that are being part of those processes, and we act like they are not asymmetries. So we act like, oh, everyone came to the meeting and we're all talking, and everyone's point of view, it's being recognized and integrated, right? Those perspectives are being integrated, when the reality is not, right? We want representation. We are encouraging this engagement, broader engagement. But at the end of the day, I think the step beyond that will be to really examine, okay, people came to the meeting, people are being part of the solution, but are their perspectives and their interests actually making it to the paper, to the outcomes that are gonna, that are reflective of what happened in those meetings? And so I think this is why I focus on power, right? Because the facilitators at those meetings, the government officials, and the people that are supposedly, guiding and leading these processes really need to be, conscious and aware that of this extreme inequalities and extreme power asymmetries when we think about those solutions. Because if we continue to act as policymakers, as government officials, like, oh, we got the people at the table and that's enough. Well, surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, we're finding that even in those supposedly ambitious processes, we are not seeing the transformative change that they're supposed to, be seeking forward, because there's this very embedded power interests that are dominating and are capturing, there's elite capture at those in those policy processes, which is preventing them from having more transformative results. And that's what I'm finding in my research. So I think lack of imagination, but also recognizing the extreme power asymmetries that we see in these policy processes that are preventing transformation. Thank you.
Thanks, Linda. Some good points raised there. Of course, having more, ideas and imagination brought forward are critical, but we need to go beyond just procedural inclusion and actually change the governance arrangements. So lots more that I think we could discuss on this, but we have a number of questions from the audience that I think we'll move to. And so let's see how many we can get through. We've got 6 open. So one from an anonymous attendee said, in light of Deborah's perspective on the human nature relationships influence approaches to risk assessment, adaptation, and similar frameworks in water and climate justice. Have similar approaches incorporated these suggestions that meaningful change requires a fundamental change, or a shift in the current paradigm requires a fundamental change of how humans relate to the world, the natural world. So I think it's like have these ideas about like moving beyond this crisis, thinking about this crisis of relationship and how to move beyond that, to think about human environment relationships differently. Are there any examples of where we can actually see this in practice? Whether it's, on a smaller scale or, yeah, I think to see some potentially positive examples, if anyone has any.
Well, I read the response, and the person just said anybody can feel free to answer the question as well. But I'll just try to answer it. It's a good question. The part of the paradigm shift that I find is required. Hopefully, you can hear me because the dog just decided at this moment to start shrieking and barking. You know how that is. And is the approach that we take, and Shamir kind of talked about this a little bit, is and the way that we're funded, the way that we try to understand and work with climate changes is extremely siloed. Like mitigation, adaptation, two different things, and if you talk about them interchangeably, people get quite upset in the circles I'm in. Now that's mitigation, that's a different panel, resilience, risk, vulnerability. So they're really they're very siloed. And but I find that the way that people actually experience climate change isn't siloed at all. Like, so it's not, I don't sometimes like to use a word in this context because it gets so overused, and what does it mean anyway? Taking a holistic approach. So when I think about how Indigenous folks who are still on the land, they're doing all of those things, but in a holistic way. So before you go out to hunt, or you're going on the ice, you're doing a risk assessment. You're doing all of those things, but you're not saying, hey, I'm doing a risk assessment. Hey, I'm doing adaptation or mitigation. So people are doing this all the time, but we haven't done a great job. If I consider myself a climate researcher, of trying to figure out breaking down kind of the silos, and then how do you approach it more holistically to truly understand the experience of people. So my view is to hopefully kind of answer the question, is that the people that are mentioned already have climate knowledge. They already do, because they're experiencing it. It isn't always like what I'm reading in a paper somewhere. That's kind of the knowledge a lot of the times I'm stuck with in the work I do. But and then how do we get it into spaces to influence policy in the way that Linda talked about it, or in the way that others around the panel have talked about it? I think the other thing that's a paradigm shift, again, relying sort of on the work of Kyle White, because he's thought about this a lot longer than I have, and I agree with a lot of what he's saying, is he thinks that he calls it kinship time. So the way that we kind of think about climate change is very linear. If you do this, this is the outcome. But he again talks about it as being very relational and not so much linear. And again, incorporating in our relationships with the natural world. I think in some ways, the nature-based solutions is kind of humans' attempt at trying to connect with nature in a particular way, like nature-based solutions or ecosystem services, which to me, yeah, I guess, but I have some ontological issues with the whole concept. But yeah, so I've been trying to think through, like, how would you ever present a different kind of paradigm that would make sense to people who are totally into the one that I find myself having to work in all the time. So I don't know if that's kind of really helpful, other than people are doing it, but as researchers, we have to do a better job of trying to get it into the spaces that can maybe inspire others and influence some of these broader processes. So I'll stop there because it felt a little rambly there towards the end, but others, I'm happy to hear from others as well.
I'll jump in, and then I have to quickly exit, but this is an amazing conversation. I would say, building on that, one of the things is, how do we get humans out of the way of both the problem and the decision making? And I think of something that the late Charlie Nelson told me probably over 10 years ago. And his question was simple. His assessment, when I asked him what the answer to a particular environmental question was, he returned with a question and said, what would the moose do? And he didn't say, like, what would the moose think, or what framework would they apply, but he actually talked about action. So what would the moose do? And I think that there's a very interesting opportunity to kind of rethink lenses. So I don't know how to operationalize this, but it really stood like it stood out for me. It you know, challenging the way that we think of humans as part of or the center of the problem and also the solution, and reframing it to a completely different perspective, one that has a long relationship with land. So it becomes relational, it becomes experiential, it has the potential to be plural. And so, yeah, what could we learn from our other than human relations about how they enact their sets of responsibilities rather than make decisions about something that is external to them? So add that to the conversation.
Thanks. Any other comments on that one? Okay, so as Klemiek, who's a professor here at University of Manitoba, says, given the panelists have discussed science tech approaches to climate solutions, I'd like to hear the panelists' perspectives on what is the antithesis of these kinds of solutions, namely the current race by our governments and academic institutes in their unflinching adoption of things like Gen AI, LLM-based technologies, given the energy and water impact of these jobs. I know at least one of you has been doing a little bit of work on AI and the water climate nexus. So not sure if one of you wants to jump in.
Sure. I think you're referring to me, Nicole. So, although it could be someone else, I don't know. So I may not be understanding the question fully. I think there might be a couple questions in there. But I also, maybe I'll answer your question a slightly different way. I hope that's okay with you. I think there's actually a connection here, right? There's a connection here between, you know, the rise of Gen AI, LLMs, and the reproduction of a lot of water insecurities and climate issues. And I think why I say it's a connection is also because a lot of these AI-based approaches are increasingly seen as ways of optimizing particular processes. So like maybe supply chain management, increasing efficiencies, and so forth. So I think you might see AI even being brought into the kind of climate space and the decision-making space very soon. But it's also going to be creating a lot of issues that people are very concerned about. So I can speak a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing around looking at the water insecurity impacts, specifically of what we call hyperscaler data centers. And a lot of the data centers are kind of, in short, the kind of the backbone, the kind of like infrastructural set of tools that are needed to power things like, you know, ChatGPT, the Internet of Things. Many of the applications that we take for granted are facilitated through these huge infrastructural investments, which of course require a lot of water and they require a lot of energy as well. But I think where we start to see these things creating even more issues is not just in terms of the amount of water that they're using or the amount of energy that they're creating, which are substantial, but also in terms of what those consumptive metrics mean in specific places. So we've been surveying numerous kind of court cases and filings in the US around where communities are frankly quite concerned with the rise of these infrastructural data centers, as well as where journalists and individual citizens have reached out to get more information and have kind of been denied that information and have subsequently sued to get it. But what we're kind of seeing is that there are at least four different types of climate and water risks that are happening. One is that there is kind of an undermining of democratization and water governance that we see. So what I mean by that is that, for example, there are cases where public information around water consumption is not released and is branded something like an industry trade secret, right? So there's kind of a prevention in giving that level of information. We also see cases where communities are essentially allocating huge proportions of their water for these kinds of facilities. And at least one or two that we've been able to find, there's a serious risk that these communities will encounter a water deficit in the next, 5 or 10 years or whatever it is. That also has implications for the flexibility and resilience of water systems. How do we deal with shocks like droughts, or when we really need water, we might not actually have it? And also there's a lot of kind of indirect use, right, with energy. And if we're relying more on fossil fuels versus more clean energy sources, that has a lot of consequences for the amount of water that we're using. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question properly, but I wanted to just make note that there is quite a strong relationship between the rise of Gen AI and also potentially how it may be seen as a solution to climate and non-climate problems, but also reproducing some of the issues that we care about a lot and that many of the panelists here are invested in trying to address.
Yeah, and certainly I think we could have a whole other webinar just on that topic. It really piques my interest. Thank you so much to all the panelists. We do have one more question in the chat. We're not going to have time to get to it today, but I do want to acknowledge that with any climate solution, yes, we can introduce new inequalities, and often different parties are benefiting and making money off climate mitigation approaches, right? As well as climate mitigation, whether it's through renewables or carbon capture and storage, introduce new social and environmental harms that we need to think a lot more about. Yeah, so I think lots more to talk about on this topic, but thank you so much for sharing your time with us, and to all the audience members for attending today. This was a really generative conversation. So with that, we'll end here. So thank you.